Good afternoon. Welcome to the Baker Institute. My name is Regina Buono, and I'm the Fellow in Energy and the Environment here in the Center for Energy Studies. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. But first, to give you a little background, this is the fourth and last talk in a series on climate change policy that the Center for Energy Studies has done this summer, or rather this spring. And this is all leading into a paper which will be done by the center and hopefully released sometime in the early fall. So keep an eye out for that. Our speaker today is John Matthews. John is the Secretariat Coordinator for the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. He's authored multiple works on adapting water infrastructure to the impacts of climate change and on decision-making frameworks for resiliency, water management, and sustainable economic development. John is a Senior Water Fellow at Colorado State University, and he holds a PhD in ecology from the University of Texas. Today, John will discuss water as a bridge to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Please welcome John Matthews.
Thanks very much, and I'm really grateful to Regina for inviting me and not for saying a lot of the embarrassing things about me that she knows. So I might also just say that I think an 8th or a 9th generation Texan. I grew up in Tyler, Texas. I have family all over the state. I've lived in Houston. It was about 15 years ago, and Galveston. My wife went to UTMB. So this is it's nice to give a talk in Texas, to be in this environment and talking about water issues. Usually I'm, delivering a PowerPoint in the Netherlands or in Korea or someplace. So it's nice to be closer to home. So I'm going to be talking about what I call operational climate policy. I was asking Regina about what some of the other speakers have discussed, and I'm going to focus on what I think is a slightly different set of issues. I think a lot of the usage of the term policy has become kind of fraud. It makes people nervous. It certainly makes me nervous. It makes me feel like I probably am not wearing a nice enough suit. I am often accused by scientists, I'm an aquatic ecologist by training, of being a policy person. At the same time, most of the real policy people I know say, you are such a scientist. This is my son, Austin is his name, and he is trying to decide if he is a science person or a policy person. The hint there is that he's holding a field guide to some of the local Oregon fungi. So I think he has an answer, even if I don't personally. But I also feel like these labels are a little bit useless. If we are engaged in technical knowledge production, we should also be engaged with decision makers. And if we are engaged in the policy process, enabling policy, then we should also be going to people that have maybe more technical or expert level knowledge. And sometimes these worlds can collide. That's an image of the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. I love it because it's probably the most fractal building that I am aware of worldwide. It has so many levels and depths to it. You can look at it in so many different levels. And it's beautiful as well. And I think that's an appropriate background for this topic. If we think on the policy side, most of us are thinking that maybe at the state level or the federal level, or perhaps in terms of climate policy, where especially this year, much like in 2010, we're thinking at a global level. What happens when heads of state get together, or at least cabinet level, ministerial level people, and they try to sort out some of the big issues about how we channel development aid, how we think about carbon emissions and restructuring economies. But I tend to focus much more at the level of what I call operational policy. It's the decision-making processes that are often at an institutional level. Sometimes they're maybe at an agency level. And that often, I think, is the kind of sweet spot for people that are working in technical knowledge. And that ideally, that information should also drift upwards. It should at least be enabled by higher policy levels. And what you should be generating there is some type of insight, and that movement upwards is a really critical, and in 2015, it's an especially critical component. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus much more on the operational policy level, how particular institutions essentially write their software for how they make consistent, systematic decisions. I'm happy to talk in the question and answer part about global level policy. I'm very active in that, both at the US level and internationally. And in terms of international climate change in general, or perhaps there's some of you that are interested in the Sustainable Development Goals too. That's also another, the SDGs, that's another big issue that's being negotiated this year. So what I'm going to talk about from here on out is how we think about long-term sustainable water management and making sure that the solutions for sustaining water over really long periods of time are actually commensurate with the kinds of challenges that we face. This is a picture of the Hoover Dam. You're going to see several other images of the Hoover Dam over the course of this talk, because it's kind of the poster child of the intersection between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And the reason for that is that white mark that I just highlighted in red. It's right now, as of today, it's about 110 feet tall. That's the bathtub ring. That's the space between what that dam was designed for and how much water is actually available now. And it's not because people upstream have stuck their straws into that river and have sucked it all out. It's because there's not that much water there anymore. It's because there's not that much rain, there's not that much snow in the upper Colorado basin. This is close to Las Vegas. It gets about 11 inches, about 25 centimeters of rain each year on an average year. And for some decades now, we've seen an absolute trend in decline in water there. So at the same time, from a climate mitigation perspective, what is that dam supposed to do? It's supposed to make clean energy. And there's a contradiction there. Maybe in some cases we can't do the same kinds of clean energy that we thought we could because of climate change issues. So my three kind of big points, I'm going to talk about my three big points at the start of my talk instead of at the end, are water is deeply embedded in institutions, in economies, in our governance relationships, the way that we work together, the way that we try to negotiate issues. Environmental relationships are usually mediated. The kind of interface between humans and the environment is usually through long-lived infrastructure. And that's important because if infrastructure lasts a long time, then it is relevant to climate impacts. And the last point is that the water cycle is evolving really rapidly right now. It's been changing since about the 1940s. A little bit after World War II is when the trend started to be detectable, but it has begun to accelerate very rapidly. Again, picking up speed in the 1970s, and in the last decade, seeming to leap forward a bit right now. And I'm going to be talking about what that means in terms of policy, operational policy, which I would define as technical knowledge plus experience. You could substitute evidence plus decision-making processes. So this is another one of my favorite buildings in the world, Pantheon in Rome. Kind of the two poles of my discussion are going to be how do we develop that insight and how do we communicate that to the appropriate audiences. So I'm going to talk about two big challenges to begin with. The first one is the world is going to get a lot more dams. I travel a lot for my work. Since around 2007, I have about 1 million flight miles. All these photographs are from places that I've worked. This is up on the Tibetan Plateau, about 4,000 meters. So dams are big. How big are dams? There are about 8,000 or so large dams in the US. There are about 75,000 dams total. That's about 10% of the number of dams globally. There are about 850,000 of them globally. And we spend a lot of money on water globally. The numbers that are published, the most recent ones are about 750 billion US, but I think the actual number is probably somewhere between 1.5 and 2 trillion. So it's a much larger number that we're really talking about. This is a very significant part of any national budget. In terms of single institutions, the World Bank is an institution I work very closely with. In 2013, they spent alone $12 billion on water-related investments. And so that's one institution. KfW, for instance, spends, at the German Development Bank, it spends roughly the same amount of money, maybe a little bit more if you include their German investments. European Investment Bank spends about 3 billion, 4 billion euros. So there are relatively, in terms of the big players, there aren't that many that are operating on a large scale. So there's a kind of a gap between the big spenders and then a lot of the little spenders. And what's also an important point is that decision makers, say in the process of the development of the Hoover Dam, we've tended to focus on kind of single sector, maybe two sector impacts. The Hoover Dam was built for flood control for Arizona and water storage for the area around Las Vegas. As an afterthought, they put in the hydropower, and then they realized that was a really useful thing to have had. But in most of the world, there's, say, in Ethiopia, in China, the kinds of investments that people are making, they also tend to be very kind of narrowly defined. There's usually not a kind of a larger environmental framework that people are thinking about. If they're being maybe thinking more broadly, they might say, we are focused on alleviating poverty in this region. But it's still a fairly traditional econometric perspective. And the rate of investment seems to be increasing very significantly. These are 2010 figures from the World Commission on Dams, and that shows the amount of hydropower at a continent level, how much it's been exploited to date. So the US, or North America more generally, because Canada and Mexico also have very significant hydro investments, and Europe and Australia, we've really kind of maxed out. It would be hard for us to find a place to put a new dam. If you look at Africa, the scale of investment is increasing very, very rapidly. There's one set of dams in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, that they will double the amount of installed hydropower when they flick the switch on. For the whole continent. So the Grand Renaissance Dam will make it go up about half that much again. So there are big things that are happening in Africa. China is, and Japan too, since Fukushima, have also been really exploiting their own hydropower potential. Dams last a damn long time. These are some pictures from a place called the Duzhongyang irrigation system. It was designed by a single engineer in 256 BC. It serves 20 million people outside of Chengdu in Sichuan province. It is a fantastic place and part of a big network. They have a really interesting governance system that kind of has spanned multiple dynasties and the current communist government. It's a kind of a beautiful example of a system that has functioned very well in the face of immense change, including climate change, and endures. This engineer even included a fish ladder. So it's a very impressive piece. It's not that it was perfect when it was built, but it has been flexible enough that it has endured very relevantly. The oldest hydropower dams, the oldest one is Niagara Falls, 1887. It's still working, still producing energy, upgraded several times over its lifetime. That's going to continue. Almost all the old hydropower dams are still working. The Three Gorges Dam, it's one of the largest dams in the world. The chief engineer was asked in the year 2000, how long will your dam last? And he said, forever. So that's how engineers think. They think over really long time scales. Decision makers don't usually think over that time scale. As our changing relationship with the environment and as the environment itself changes, those become more problematic. Second challenge is that eco-hydrological systems, you could say rivers if you wanted to, are very dynamic in response to lots of kinds of impacts, including climate change, but water management systems are often much less dynamic. This is a chart of flow data from the Colorado River near Lee's Ferry. And the Colorado Compact governs, it's a piece of governance that manages the US side of the Colorado River. And it was signed in 1922, and they had that much flow data, the little red strip there, about 30 years when they wrote the Colorado Compact. This is tree ring data, and it shows over the past 1,200 years how flows in the Colorado River have evolved, and they've been very dynamic. Some of those changes have been quite dramatic. And in some form of cruel irony, the 30 years that they picked to create the Colorado Compact, to base the delivery mechanisms, to think about the kind of larger infrastructure plan, were the wettest 30 years in the past 1,200. So and if anything, right now, you can argue whether it's climate change or not, but the system is kind of recentering back to the 1,200-year mean. So that's what's happening in Colorado right now. So we have a big mismatch. And we have an inflexible governance system and inflexible infrastructure, and that has important implications for the economic development of that larger region. Why is that important? Because 30 years of data would be considered fantastic in Rwanda. 30 years of data would be fantastic in Chad or in Thailand. In Kazakhstan, 30 years of data is good in most of the world. So the economic development going from 1935 of being 5,000 people in Las Vegas to 1.8 million right now, that's the story that people in East Africa and in Central Asia want to hear right now. That's their mode of economic development. And also the risks that are inherent in it. And what does that look like? I call it the climate orphaning of infrastructure. At the time of its creation in the 1940s, when it filled up, it was at 1,200 feet above sea level. In 2000, it was still pretty close to that, but it's fallen very dramatically since then. The dashed line is where it is right now, as of a couple of weeks ago. And there are very credible estimates that between 2026 and 2035 that it's going to hit dead pool. One of the most complicated construction projects of the past century was what's called the bathtub drain for Lake Mead that's just recently completed. And it's because the intake valves are so close to being way up above the water level, they had to drill something that I understand is more complicated than the channel between England and France. They went in underneath the reservoir so they can suck every last little bit of water out before the river becomes a river again and not a reservoir. So that's a 1.5 billion climate adaptation project in the US. So I'm going to talk about two solutions two general solutions and some applications of those approaches that I think are commensurate with challenges that we face. I am the secretariat for a group that I helped found with a colleague from the World Bank that's called AGUA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. He's from Uruguay, so he picked the name. And there are about 650 people in the AGUA network. We function somewhere between an NGO and a think tank. We're located quite globally. Most of us are water people who we think that climate change, especially climate adaptation, is really important to our daily work. We're co-chaired by two organizations. The water team at the World Bank Group, that's Diego Rodriguez,
and seaweed, the Stockholm International Water Institute. It's a Swedish water think tank that's largely funded by the Swedish aid agency, SIDA. And we have kind of two broad areas of focus on technical knowledge and bringing together different bodies of technical knowledge, and then high-level policy work, so working with the UN Climate Change Convention or the SDGs. I'm going to focus on the former. So these two solutions. The first is to really think about what we call now bottom-up approaches to vulnerability analysis. If we think about how we've traditionally tended to analyze vulnerability, really to measure risk to climate or climate change, we've tended to think in terms of extreme events. We've become a little bit more quantitative recently in the last 15 years or so with using climate models. These are called broadly top-down approaches, where we basically go to a friendly neighborhood climate scientists. We ask them to take a global scale model and then downscale it to make it more localized, so we can begin to include it in our water management models, or maybe help Houston think about how its flood risk may be changing over time. It might be using it for planning purposes. In general, these are relatively low confidence quantitative results, and especially for engineers, a lot of water managers, it's hard for them to work with. They don't feel good about it. Starting around 2008, there's been a movement to use these bottom-up approaches. And that's where, instead of starting with climate models, what you do is you actually go to the people who live in a basin. And you talk to those stakeholders, and you say, how do you define success and failure? It's really starting with the governance process and having them define what success and failure is. And then bringing the technical data. Can include climate models, but it might be other applications as well. It might be paleo data from the flow regime 5 or 10,000 years ago, and try to understand the kind of full context in which decisions are being made. And then you can very dynamically test theories about plausibility and applicability. And this is good because you've already engaged the stakeholders. It tends to be high confidence, and it makes the engineers happy because it is a very quantitative output. This was recently developed by the Army Corps of Engineers in their management, co-management with Canada, of Lake Superior, a transboundary basin, and has recently started to get some pretty high-level attention. I got a call last week from the State Department that the White House is very interested in this approach. It's called decision scaling. And it's decision scaling is a slightly ironic twist on downscaling. The other kind of broad area that we've been working on is how is that we integrate more flexible and holistic approaches to economic analysis. And if you think about the way that we make decisions right now, they tend to be focused, if we have a set of options, on making a 100-year decision all at once and trying to choose which of a set of options is the most important. And we often have an economic horizon that's very different than the planning horizon. And if you compare those two approaches, say, again, the World Bank or the Army Corps of Engineers, they are limited to 20 years, 30 years. Sometimes it's even mandated at a statute level, that you're not allowed to think past that moment. And this kinds of solutions that you would come up with in a 20 or 30-year window are very different than the kinds of solutions that you would think about over a 100-year method. So we've been working on building an approach that was developed in the Netherlands called adaptation pathways, in which you try to think across options and how you move across those options through time, and you really integrate economic tools that reinforce that flexibility. We're developing that with the OECD and a group called Deltatis, as well as the World Bank right now. They call this the Metro Map. Here's a case study that's publishing in August. I like to think about how is it you can really take some of the exciting ideas that have been emerging in economics and the sciences, in engineering, and actually make it into something that's kind of like a recipe, so that somebody that doesn't care about climate change, that they just know that they need to check that box. And so we've been working very much with the loan officers, for instance. Inside of the World Bank, we've developed a methodology. The lead authors are at the University of Massachusetts, Patrick Ray and Casey Brown, to include both of these approaches, decision scaling and adaptation pathways, and in a very stepwise, very explicit kind of decision tree. So officially, for the World Bank at least, climate adaptation will be quite mainstream for their water investments and very, very boring as of August or so. But that's just one audience. We've been trying to take this to other levels too. Green bonds are a relatively new part of the global bonds market. They were developed by the European Investment Bank and the World Bank around 2007. They were kind of small then. They were meant to particularly advertise environmental benefits, especially climate benefits. Sometimes they're called climate bonds. But there's no standard. There's no really clear way to say if something really is a good climate bond, a good green bond, or a bad one. How green is it, is the way that one financial analyst called it. So at least for the water-related groups, AGWA has been working with a consortium led by the Climate Bonds Initiative in London to develop a set of explicit standards. Again, this is at one level of abstraction, even more than what the World Bank loan officers are using, so that water managers, say San Francisco water utility, as well as someone like JP Morgan, can find a kind of common ground that both on the investor side and on the water manager side, you find a common ground to make sure that the water projects are really good investments from a climate perspective. And what's important here is that you see there's two poles there in the center of this, where all the lines are kind of centered. The climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Climate mitigation, you can think of that maybe as a typical project as a hydropower project, like the Hoover Dam. What would we tell the engineers for the Hoover Dam to do differently today? We'd walk them through this tree, and at a certain point in that tree, you would be required to cross over to the other side and actually do a climate adaptation vulnerability assessment and develop an adaptation plan, and that it will inevitably result in a very different kind of water investment. And hopefully, it's going to be hard for us to fix the Hoover Dam, but maybe we can help Rwanda and Tanzania come up with a better investment standard. And this is a piece that is coming out in Nature Climate Change online next week. I had kind of hoped that maybe it was publishing this week. And then it also is being referenced in a science article in August. And this is a methodology that was developed with the National Science Foundation. It's taking decision scaling, which is really about engineers and stakeholders being able to communicate to each other, and also carving out some space for the environment as a stakeholder, and trying to integrate them in that process. And what that looks like is very abstract in this image. But if we think about these are the kinds of charts that engineers really like. On the left side, we see an engineering performance metric. How well is a piece of water infrastructure meeting its design specifications? Maybe it's water delivery or flood protection, irrigation, crop yield. But we can do the same thing if we use a set of ecological metrics to look at the ecological impact. And what's great about this is, instead of doing a kind of environmental impact statement that's at the end of a project life cycle, we can actually do it right at the beginning, when it's easy to make significant changes and realize those trade-offs very early in the project development. So we can find the common space. And that's the spot that we'll design for and manage for. So this is a process that we're really excited about, and again, there are several major partners inside of AGWA that are interested in scaling up with this. For instance, the Corps of Engineers has they have a massive number of investments. One subcommittee in the House, for instance, is sitting alone on $30 billion US on hydropower projects, and they're interested in taking this type of approach and making it part of their standard methodology. Again, making it utterly boring. Thank you very much. I'd love to get some questions.
Thank you for clear illustrations in your discussion. You talked about the lack of full cycle thinking often, traditionally, and a lot of what we hear about and we see, particularly in the developing world, sound like 19th and 20th century hammers on 21st century nails.
That's right.
Does this decision approach help to get away from that and go for things that might be appropriate to whatever problem is attempted to be solved?
I believe so. I think one of the kind of more general trends that we see globally and in many nations is a kind of democratization of decision-making processes. You know, if you think back to the way that a lot of foreign aid worked through groups like development banks or through European or North American or Australian donors, we basically went in and we said, this is what you're going to do. And it was often not particularly focused on the priorities and needs of that country or that region. And we moved beyond that. And it's actually kind of come up from the Global South to say, we want you to do what we're doing and to follow our priorities now. You might have read some news stories even in the past few weeks about China has created its own development bank. And the Europeans have invested inside of it, just the same way that the US and Europeans are the kind of traditional funders for the capital of the World Bank. And why did China do that? Because China said, you want to fund some of the wrong things. You know, we want to set our priorities. We want to figure out what's important to us. And I think that's also part of this story about defining 21st century solutions for 21st century problems, is this kind of broadening of how it is that we make decisions and being more inclusive of other kinds of power centers that are involved. And I believe that the kind of generally the bottom-up approach of really engaging with stakeholders, whether it's at a local level. We have projects, for instance, in northern Thailand that are applying decision scaling, that there's a town and there's a mayor that's involved in that process, and there are a couple of energy facilities, and there's a group of farmers, and there's an urban water manager, that they are sitting around and they are literally saying, this is what a good year looks like, this is what a bad year looks like, this is what we think is really important for us in 20 years. But that scales up. We're also working with the Mekong River Commission at a sub-basin and basin level, and trying to engage with individual countries as well. So I think that's a sign of progress. I think it's not just one way to define problems anymore, and it really requires a big group of people to come up with the right definition. It's not just a technically defined problem and a technically defined solution.
Hi, first, thanks for an excellent presentation. Question has to do with the climate bonds and issues like what's the vision for the efficaciousness of that? What's the objective? How is it going to work? And I'm thinking of an analogy of tax credits used to save rainforests. And I've heard about that. and I don't know if it's the same kind of operation.
It's quite different. You're referring probably to initiatives around forest carbon, perhaps, and trying to achieve multiple benefits by paying countries like, say, Brazil, or DRC is another country that's received a lot of forest carbon credit, to keep their carbon in the ground, or in the leaves, so to speak, by keeping their forest intact. And they've tried to monetize that process, and it's had very mixed results. I think they got a little bit out ahead of the science when they were defining that policy. And my understanding, I'm not a specialist in the area, is that it's largely being underwritten by the Norwegian government at this point, from a global perspective. So there's still a lot of negotiation. This program is called RED, usually, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's something that hopefully we can make work. The bonds work is really, what's a typical bond? I live in Oregon, and one of the very first green bonds offerings that I read as part of this project was from Spokane, Washington. And they wanted to install a new stormwater system for their city, and they said it was because the runoff from storms was becoming more extreme, and so they saw it as a climate adaptation methodology, an investment that they needed for their city in order to cope with shifting conditions. I've talked to, also in the U.S., DC Water and San Francisco Water and Las Vegas and Seattle Public Utilities. They regularly issue green bonds. A lot of the bonds, green bonds, have started to shift out of the kind of cities in developed countries to corporations, and also into areas outside of the developed world. So you're starting to see a lot of green bonds that are in say, West Africa, and it's a way to try and signal to investors that this has an environmental benefit. There's often ultimately, what we see is kind of two scores. There'll be a financial rating, just like any bond, that says this is a credible investment. You're going to get your money back out of it, and here's the level of risk we think is associated with that. But there's also some credibility between the environmental benefit that investors can expect. And some investors are interested in that. I think that's why the green bond market has grown so rapidly. Just as maybe like another aside, these issues we engage very much with the private sector too. Shell, for instance, is hosting an AGWA workshop with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in 2 weeks in The Hague. That's really about being able to bring some of these same perspectives that we have around decision scaling and more flexible economic instruments and adaptation pathways into Shell's system and many of the other oil companies that will also be attending that workshop.
Thanks for your talk. I really found it very, very insightful. You raised the issue of how a bottoms-up approach is probably the most effective way of dealing with water management issues. But given that a lot of rivers and water basins sort of cover multiple countries and boundaries, how much of a cooperation do you see between countries on working on various water management issues? And conversely, how much do you see them being used as a strategic element to sort of prevent others from developing? I'm thinking particularly about the Middle East in this regard.
That's a great question. The topic of transboundary climate adaptation, transboundary water management more generally, is a huge issue. If you think about 60% of the rivers in Africa and other water bodies, lakes too, because there's a bunch of lakes, big lakes, 60% of them are transboundary, and 30% of them are between 3 or more countries. Bangladesh, I think of it as the bathtub drain for Asia. There are 67 rivers in Bangladesh, and 65 of them are transboundary. They are incredibly vulnerable to what Nepal does and what India does and Bhutan and China. It matters. These issues are very complicated because it's not just water that flows downstream, it's also power. And hierarchies of relationship. A really good example is in the Mekong in Southeast Asia. A very poor country, one of the poorest countries in all of Asia is Laos. And they are in the final stages of completing a dam called the Shai Buri. And they basically built it with private investment money from China and Thailand that they could sell the power to Thai manufacturers. And what is that? Why is that bad? Well, they did it in spite of the kind of existing governance agreements, and Vietnam downstream is the delta. And they are terrified about losing their sediment. Why is that sediment important? Because this is a rice-based country, and there's very active sea level rise. So if you starve the delta of sediment, agricultural impacts will surely follow, and sea level rise will be accelerated. So your question, that's a preface, for how serious this particular issue is. And these relationships change too over time as the hydrological cycle continues to evolve. There is some really good news. There's a UN branch, UN agency that's called the Economic Commission of Europe, and in spite of it having that European focus, they actually have a fantastic program in it that's called Transboundary Climate Adaptation Secretariat. Is funded by the Germans and the Dutch and the Italians largely, and it's gone global. And Nicaragua is involved. Central Asia is very involved, and it is really developing explicit negotiation, diplomatic approaches in order to help set up functional systems so that we don't end up with something like the Colorado Compact for Bangladesh. That's really rigid. That you've got dams that are exploding in that region in terms of their rate of development, and that we don't basically get trapped in making a poor country much poorer than it should be otherwise. So there's a lot of attention that's being placed on that. They have a recent publication, I think it came out in April, that you can find on the UNECE side or on the AGWA side. I think we referenced it there too.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm interested in desalination as a solution to water shortages in the U.S. or elsewhere. And I sort of have a three-part question, which is how viable a solution is it? What's the cost? How expensive can it be? And why might people resist the desalination?
A very good question. Thank you. Desal is a complicated issue. The most extensive desal that I'm aware of globally is on the Arabian Peninsula or in some of the areas around there. These tend to be large, very dry coastal cities. They have cheap energy that's readily accessible, and they have increasing water demand. And they've kind of outstripped their traditional water storage and harvesting technologies that often have served them well for millennia. So how do you develop a city like Dubai or Doha in that context? And you really have to use something like desal. California has started to explore desal in a more consistent way. California is really a very dry state. We don't really realize how sometimes how dry much of California is. We get a lot of rain in especially East Texas, and California does not have that wealth, and it's also a highly variable system. So cities like Santa Barbara have started to explore desal. I think it's inevitable that a city like Los Angeles will begin to explore it as well. The question then again is energy.
And we've already seen quite a few green bonds, for instance, that have been offered around desalination. And one way that you might be able to balance that in the context of a green bond is if you're able to use a renewable energy source. And so there's the engineering challenges around the desalination process have been evolving very rapidly, but the energy supply, the kind of fuel shift technology has also been evolving very rapidly. So you can imagine that there is going to be an increasing number of applications. I would predict that it becomes something like microhydro, the very tiny, very often very localized hydropower developments that are also in a current period of explosion. Why would someone be opposed to it? That was your last question? So I'm not an expert in the area, but my understanding is that desalination is a byproduct of extracting the fresh water out of the salt water creates a kind of hyper-concentrated brine. And what do you do with that brine? And it's a necessary byproduct. And that brine in a place like the Red Sea that's very biodiverse, very ecologically rich, it could cause some problems. It could cause some problems in you imagine California Marine Sanctuary too. So we have to think really carefully about what happens to that brine. And I think that's been a big issue. It's also right now fairly expensive, so there are some objections too from the financial side.
In the context of a changing hydrologic cycle and what the G7 proposed earlier this week, eliminating fossil fuels totally by 2100. How does building dams affect ecosystem services upstream and downstream? And what sort of percentage does hydropower play in the energy cocktail going into the future towards 2100?
Those are really big questions. I'll try to give as concise answers as I can. The impacts of building hydropower dams on ecosystems are significant, and it's still I would say is a qualitative science rather than a quantitative science. We know we can see the impacts. It's often difficult for us to be able to predict a lot of them, but things like connectivity and often the kind of full set of resources like sediment I mentioned in the Mekong. That's not an ecosystem, but it's still ecologically very important. Those things can be highly modified. We can, in some cases, improve the operation of those dams. One of the things that places like Australia and the US and South Africa are known for globally, and especially Texas, is the expertise in an area called environmental flows, which is the operating rules for a dam, so that it can mimic some of the ecological functions that are associated with a free-flowing or natural river. The Texas Water Board is a global powerhouse on environmental flows. Often referred to in places like the Caucasus or in East Africa. So there is some way that you can try to minimize or compromise some of those impacts. How important is hydropower going to be going forward? Sense of scale. I mentioned microhydro a few minutes ago. Austria has 5,000 microhydro developments in process right now. 5,000. And these would be on what you would call a creek. And it's highly, they're rapidly decentralizing their power grid. In the Himalayas, a 2013 study suggested that there were over 300 medium to large, mostly large, hydropower dams in the Himalayas alone. And I suspect it's gone up another 10 to 20% since then. Hydropower has been, on the climate mitigation side, when we think about the pace of climate change, we think about greenhouse gas emissions, we think about clean energy, hydropower has been sort of our first base. And it's where a lot of policymakers have jumped to. It's like, oh, well, we can put in some hydropower, and that'll work really well. I think that it's starting to sink in some audiences, that maybe some of that hydropower, it's not as easy to design, so it's going to deliver the full operational lifetime benefits that we thought that it might. So that 2100 goal is possible with hydropower as a significant part of it, but we need to make sure that we don't completely trash the ecosystem services and the ecosystems that are part of it. Environmental flows is really important. And another big aspect of it is making sure that we really get the expected clean energy benefit that we have designed and planned for.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and make that the last question. But on behalf of the Baker Institute, I'd like to thank John for such an illuminating talk. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and wish you a good afternoon. Thanks.